In this technical training module, we will discuss how to configure a BrightSign player for simple file networking. As previously discussed, BrightSign players support publishing via 4 basic methods. You can publish directly to an SD card, you can publish over your local area network, you can publish by means of a web server, we call this simple file networking, or you can publish using our BrightSign network hosted service. In this module, we will focus on simple file networking. We'll also focus on the setup aspects. We'll spend very little time on building presentations and publishing them. We'll simply touch on that sufficient to cover setup topics. It's important to keep in context exactly what's going to happen here. BrightAuthor, when using simple file networking, BrightAuthor does not have a direct connection to the player. BrightAuthor will publish presentations to a web shared folder that exists on a web server someplace, and the player will use its network connection to download those projects from the same web folder. Think of the web folder as an intermediary publishing point. This has the advantage that I can publish once, and some large number of players could all receive that project, as they will all undertake to update themselves. But there is the disadvantage that there's no direct connection between BrightAuthor and the player. A web server someplace in the world is required to make this work. This can be a web server that your own IT administration folks have set up somewhere in the corporate enterprise, or it could be a hosted service. GoDaddy and many of the others that will help you register domain names also offer web hosting services, and so you might have access to something up in the cloud. I do, and I will use that for the setup demonstration here today. BrightAuthor will need a method to transfer files to that web folder. If the web server is located within your enterprise, it may well be that your IT administrators can help you mount that folder as if it were a local drive. A virtual drive or a mounted drive makes publishing very, very easy. But if the folder is not available as a drive, then it will not be possible for BrightAuthor to publish directly to the folder, and you'll need to use FTP to transfer files to the folder. More on that in a moment. Keep in mind there's no direct connection. This is always important to remember this, that there's no direct connection between BrightAuthor and the players, and there is no feedback from the players back to BrightAuthor. It is a little bit blind in the sense that you will publish presentations to that folder and simply have the expectation that players will successfully download those projects. So before you begin setup, there are a few things you need to know in advance. First of all, what type of Ethernet connection will the player have? Will the connection be a physical wired connection, or will it connect via Wi-Fi? In the case of our XD players, that means the Wi-Fi option will need to be installed. There is no Wi-Fi option for an HD player. If you're using Wi-Fi, you will also need to know the network name, commonly referred to as the SSID, and the security key to access that network. Because the player is not a personal computer, there's no keyboard or mouse, you will not be able to simply browse to available networks in your area, choose one, and enter the key. It will be necessary to know that in advance. You'll also need to know how IP addresses are assigned on your network. Dynamic is the most common. The DHCP protocol, DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Control Protocol, is a method that assigns IP configuration information directly and automatically when a device connects to the network. It's very, very common in corporate environments for DHCP to be used, and it's a nice, easy way to get a device going on the network. But in some cases, DHCP is not used, and then static or fixed IP address information needs to be provided. If static is your method, then you'll need to know the specific IP address the player requires, the subnet mask for that player, and addresses for the gateway server and domain name server, also sometimes simply called the DNS server. Without these 4 pieces of information, you will not be able to complete your static IP address setup. Publishing via a web server also requires that you'll need some basic information about that server. You'll need information both for the player side of the equation and for the BrightAuthor side of the equation. The player will need to access that folder via a fully qualified HTTP URL. It cannot be a network share, a simple network share. It needs to be an actual web server running web services so that that folder can be found with a fully qualified HTTP URL. Your IT administrator who helped create that folder should be able to give that URL to you. You're going to need that when you configure the player. You will also need to be able to access the folder from BrightAuthor so that you can publish successfully. If you can mount it as a local share, that's the easiest because it will simply appear as a drive on your machine and you can publish directly to that drive. Otherwise, FTP access will be required, and whoever created that web share for you should be able to give you the FTP address and the username and password required to access that folder. I have this information for my setup, and so I believe I'm ready to proceed. I know the answer to the question, what type of Ethernet connection do I have? In my case, it's a physical hardwired connection. How are IP addresses assigned on my network? In my case, it's DHCP. It's automatic. And I have my web server information, which we'll input when the time comes. So at this point, we're ready to begin configuring our player to access and be published via simple file networking. Here we are at my desktop. I'm going to put a new and available SD card into my machine. It has appeared. We'll see that the card is blank, and I'm going to do a quick check by looking at the properties of the card to make sure it's formatted FAT32 or FAT. It could be FAT8, FAT16, FAT32, FAT something. It needs to be FAT. With that check complete and this blank card ready to go, it's in drive I. I'm going to start BrightAuthor and prepare my player for publishing via simple file networking. The first step within BrightAuthor is to make sure simple file networking is turned on. There are a handful of features and options within the application that will become active when I turn that feature on. I now choose Set up a BrightSign unit. This will give me the configuration screen that we've seen before. I'm going to enter a name for my player and a description. These are at your discretion. They can be anything you wish. Mine is a physical connection. I do not intend to use wireless. However, if wireless were to be used, I would enable it, and here I would enter the network SSID and the network key. But I'm not using wireless, so I'm turning that off, and we'll make sure wired is in first position. Here's where I have the opportunity on my wired connection to make sure that my IP address is obtained automatically by the player. In our network, we use DHCP. Were it the case that I needed to put a static configuration, I would choose use the following IP address, and then I would manually enter an IP address, subnet mask, and addresses for a default gateway and domain name server. These first 4 fields need to be complete, otherwise things will not work. The remaining 2 DNS servers are optional. Some customers, or I should say some networks, have multiple DNS servers with one as a primary and others available as backup. But at a minimum, these first 4 fields would need to be complete. In my case, everything is automatic, so I will say OK. The diagnostic web server is optional and not required. We'll cover what that tool is for in another module. Here we choose simple file networking. BrightAuthor remembers, because I've done this before on this machine, the last URL I used when building a simple file networking setup. In this case, this is the fully qualified HTTP URL to the folder on my web server. It happens to be on a domain that I have control of, the Brooksby domain, a folder called Ray and a folder called Publish. So there it is, and I'm going to use that folder for publishing, and here's where I choose how frequently the player will check in. No authentication is required at this folder. It's an open folder, and so I don't need to put any username and password here. Also, logging should be turned off. We'll talk about logging features in another module, but logging features are not required for this configuration, so we'll simply leave them off at this time. Everything here is ready to go. I'm going to say Create Setup Files, choose my memory card, and say OK. It doesn't take long because the files are small. I'll say OK. I'll close. And just for grins, let's look at the SD card. And it appears empty, but the fact is these files are just very small and there's just a lot of space still available. But I see that BrightAuthor has put a number of configuration files ready for that player. I'm going to eject that card, put that card in my BrightSign player, and start my player. Now, what's going to happen? Unless I've already published something to that folder, there will be nothing there for the player to download. The player will immediately check that folder and attempt to download a presentation, but finding none, the screen will simply remain dark until something is available there to use. So on the BrightAuthor side, I need to put a project out there that that the player can receive. I'm going to just simply choose to publish via simple file networking a project that I already have ready to go. I'll fill the schedule with this item, and notice again I've chosen simple file networking, and I need to specify a location where this publish will go. Notice this is not the web server. In my case, I cannot publish directly to my web server. I need to use FTP to move files up to that server. I cannot mount that server as a local share, so I'm not going to be able to publish directly to that server. Instead, I'm going to create on my desktop a folder that I'm simply going to call Publish as a temporary holding place for this publish. So I'm going to browse to my desktop and choose the Publish folder as the location for this publish. I'll then hit Publish. It doesn't take long because this is a small project, and this schedule, including however many projects I had put on this schedule, has now been published to this temporary location. I'm going to close BrightAuthor, and remember here on my desktop is the temporary location. And when I look in that folder, I see a bunch of stuff. This is what the player needs to receive. I need to FTP that up to my web server. I use a program called FileZilla. It's a convenient program, and so what I'm going to do is browse to my desktop, find the publish folder, and here now you see the items that need to go up to the FTP site. I'm going to connect to my server. I have previously stored username and password information, and here's the folder called Publish. I'm going to eliminate what's there. That's an old publish. This will take just a moment. The method for transferring files to your FTP site will almost certainly vary, and your IT folks are going to have to be involved helping you figure some of those little details out. But now I'm going to take my new publish and copy those up to my FTP site, and you see those files are now being written. In the meantime, my player is running and it's checking this site. You remember we configured it to check every 5 minutes. The fact is the player is a little bit in panic mode right now because there was nothing there for it. So it's going to be quite aggressive, attempting a connection about every 30 seconds. And the first time it finally gets a successful download, it will pull the project down and relax and then settle into the every 5 minute that I asked it to accomplish. This transfer is complete. I'm going to leave FileZilla and I'm finished. I have both configured my BrightSign player to receive content from that folder, and I have now published and uploaded something to that folder. I can close my laptop and go home. There can be any number of BrightSign players connected to the same folder. I could have the 1, 10, 15, 100, 200 players. It's simply a matter of available bandwidth from that web server, how many BrightSign players you connect to that folder. And really, if you need different folders to manage different groups, it's nothing more than a different URL for each group of players. That concludes our setup for simple file networking.